David Chun pushed his cleaning cart down the long hallway of the Riverside Performing Arts Center at exactly 5:30 in the morning. The building was still dark and silent, just the way he liked it. He had been doing this same routine for 15 years now, and most days felt exactly the same. Wake up at 4:45, catch the early bus, arrive before anyone else, and start cleaning before the rest of the world even thought about waking up. At 42 years old, David had become part of the furniture. People walked past him every single day without really seeing him. He was just the janitor, the guy who emptied the trash bins and mopped the floors. Sometimes people would nod or give him a quick smile, but mostly they looked right through him like he was invisible. And honestly, David had gotten used to it. He preferred being invisible. It was safer that way. His uniform was always the same. Dark blue work pants that had seen better days, a gray shirt with his name stitched on the pocket, and an old jacket he'd been wearing for at least 7 years. The zipper was broken, but he kept it anyway. David brought his lunch in the same brown paper bag every day. Usually a sandwich, an apple, and a thermos of coffee his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, made for him each morning. She was one of the few people who actually talked to him like he was a real person. The Performing Arts Center was beautiful. Massive chandeliers hung from the ceiling, velvet curtains draped the stages, and expensive paintings lined the walls. Every night, hundreds of people dressed in fancy clothes came to watch concerts and performances. They'd paid a lot of money to sit in those plush seats and listen to talented musicians play. David had free access to every show because he worked there, but he never went. Not once in 15 years. When people asked him why, he just shrugged and said he was too tired after work. But that wasn't the real reason. The truth was David stayed late almost every night. Long after the last concert ended and the audience went home, long after his shift was supposed to be over, he stayed behind. He would lock the doors, turn off most of the lights, and walk slowly into the main concert hall. The place felt different when it was empty, peaceful, like it was waiting just for him. In the center of that hall sat a magnificent Steinway grand piano. It cost more money than David would make in 10 years. The wood was polished to a perfect shine, and the keys were smooth as silk. Famous pianists from all over the world came to play this instrument. David cleaned it carefully every morning, treating it like something sacred. And every night, when no one was watching, he played it. David had taught himself to play piano when he was just 7 years old. His grandmother had an old beat-up keyboard in her tiny apartment. Half the keys didn't work properly, and it was missing one of the legs, so she had propped it up with phone books. But to young David, it was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. He spent hours figuring out which keys made which sounds, teaching himself simple songs by ear. His grandmother noticed his interest and tried to get him proper lessons, but money was always tight. She worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and the lights on. Music lessons were a luxury they couldn't afford. So David learned on his own, spending every free moment at that broken keyboard. When his grandmother passed away when he was 16, he lost access to the keyboard. The apartment was cleaned out and everything was sold or thrown away. Life got hard after that. David bounced between relatives' houses, never really belonging anywhere. He dropped out of school to work and help pay bills. First it was washing dishes at a restaurant, then loading trucks at a warehouse, then eventually the janitorial job at the Performing Arts Center. Music became a distant memory, something from another life, until he started working at the center. The first time he saw that grand piano up close, something inside him woke up. His fingers actually tingled with the memory of playing. For weeks, he just looked at it while he cleaned, never daring to touch it for anything more than polishing. But one night, when he was absolutely sure he was alone, he sat down on the bench and placed his fingers on the keys. The sound that came out was like nothing he remembered. It was rich and full and absolutely beautiful. He played a simple melody, something he'd figured out as a kid, and it brought tears to his eyes. From that night on, he couldn't stay away. David started learning more complex pieces. He found old sheet music in the center's library and taught himself to read it properly. He watched videos online in the break room during lunch, studying how professional pianists moved their hands and interpreted different composers. Every night in that empty concert hall he practiced. Chopin, Beethoven, Mozart, Rachmaninoff. He played them all, pouring his heart into every note. Nobody knew. Not his coworkers, not the director of the center, not even Mrs. Patterson, who made his coffee every morning. This was his secret, his private world. During the day, he was just David the janitor. But at night, alone with that piano, he became someone else entirely. Someone with purpose and passion and skill. Sometimes he wondered what his life would have been like if things had gone differently. If his grandmother had lived longer. If he'd had the money for lessons, if he'd finished school, maybe he would have been one of those musicians on stage, performing for packed audiences instead of cleaning up after them. But those thoughts didn't last long. David had learned not to dwell on what could have been. This was his life, and for the most part, it was okay. His coworkers were nice enough. There was Tom, another janitor who liked to talk about football. There was Lisa at the front desk who always said good morning. There was Mr. Hernandez, the maintenance supervisor who gave David his assignments each day. They were all pleasant people, but David kept his distance. He ate lunch alone, didn't go to staff parties, and never shared personal stories. It was easier that way. The Performing Arts Center was getting ready for something big. Posters were going up everywhere about the annual fundraising gala. It was the center's most important event of the year. Rich donors came from all over the city, paying $1,000 per ticket to support the arts. There would be champagne, fancy food, and a performance by some world-famous pianist David had never heard of. For David, it just meant extra work. More cleaning, more trash, more floors to mop. He didn't mind, though. Overtime meant extra money, and he needed every penny he could get. His mother's medical bills kept piling up, and his nephew needed help with college tuition. David sent money home every month, keeping just enough for rent and basic expenses. As he pushed his cleaning cart past the gala posters, David didn't give them much thought. It was just another event, another day at work. He had no idea that in just a few days, everything in his quiet, invisible life was about to change. That piano he played in secret every night was about to become the doorway to a completely different world. But for now, he was just David the janitor. Ordinary, unremarkable, and perfectly content to stay that way. Friday evening arrived faster than anyone expected. The annual gala was finally here, and the Riverside Performing Arts Center was buzzing with activity. David had never seen the place this chaotic. Caterers rushed back and forth with trays of expensive appetizers. Florists arranged massive bouquets of white roses in the lobby. Staff members in crisp uniforms checked and rechecked every detail. David stayed out of the way, focusing on his work. He had extra cleaning duties tonight, making sure every inch of the building looked perfect. The marble floors needed to shine. The bathrooms had to be spotless. Even the hallways behind the scenes needed attention because donors sometimes wandered back there. By 6 o'clock, the first guests started arriving. David watched from a distance as fancy cars pulled up to the entrance. Men in expensive suits and women in glittering dresses stepped out, laughing and chatting. Their jewelry probably cost more than everything David owned. He pushed his cleaning cart toward the back hallways, staying invisible like always. The center's director, Catherine Reynolds, was everywhere at once. She was a tall woman in her 50s who usually seemed calm and collected. David had worked there for 15 years, and he'd rarely seen her stressed. But tonight was different. Tonight she was practically running through the hallways, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor. She kept checking her phone and talking rapidly to her assistant. David was emptying a trash can near the backstage area when he first sensed something was wrong. Catherine rushed past him, her face pale. She was on the phone, and her voice had an edge of panic to it. "What do you mean he can't make it?" she said into the phone. "The performance starts in 45 minutes. We have 200 people out there who paid $1,000 each to hear him play." David paused, holding the trash bag. He knew he shouldn't eavesdrop, but he couldn't help it. Catherine listened to whoever was on the other end, and her expression grew worse. "Food poisoning? Are you absolutely certain there's no way?" She closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her forehead. "This is a disaster. An absolute disaster. She ended the call and immediately started making another one. David quietly continued his work, but he kept his ears open. Over the next 20 minutes, he pieced together what was happening. The famous pianist who was supposed to perform tonight had gotten violently ill. He was in the hospital and couldn't come. Catherine was desperately calling every pianist she knew, trying to find a replacement, but it was Friday evening. Every professional musician was either already performing somewhere else or impossible to reach on such short notice. David listened as Catherine made call after call, each one ending in disappointment. Her voice got more desperate with each conversation. "Please, there must be someone," she begged into the phone. "Anyone who can play Chopin at a professional level. I don't care what it costs." Silence. "I understand. Thank you anyway." David finished emptying the trash and was about to wheel his cart away when something strange happened. A feeling rose up inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was like a voice in his head, quiet but persistent. "You can play Chopin," it whispered. "You know you can?" He shook his head and started to walk away. "Don't be ridiculous," he told himself. "You're a janitor. You play piano in secret when nobody's watching. That's completely different from performing in front of 200 rich people who actually know music." But the voice wouldn't stop. It got louder. "When will you ever get another chance like this? You've spent 15 years hiding. 15 years playing for empty seats. What are you so afraid of?" David's hands were shaking. His heart pounded in his chest. This was crazy. Absolutely crazy. Catherine Reynolds barely knew he existed. She'd probably laugh at him or think he was making some kind of joke. But his feet weren't moving. He just stood there in the hallway, frozen. Catherine ended another unsuccessful call and leaned against the wall, looking defeated. In 30 minutes, she'd have to go on stage and tell 200 disappointed donors that there would be no performance. The center's biggest fundraiser of the year would be ruined. The reputation she'd spent decades building would take a serious hit before David could talk himself out of it. He stepped forward. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Excuse me, Ms. Reynolds." She looked up, clearly surprised to see him standing there. "David, I'm sorry. I'm dealing with a crisis right now." "Can it wait?" "I can play," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine blinked at him, confused. "What?" David took a breath and spoke louder. "I can play piano. I could perform tonight if you need someone." For a moment, Catherine just stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Then her expression shifted to something between annoyance and disbelief. "David, this isn't the time for jokes. I really need to focus on finding a solution." "I'm not joking," David said, and he was surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "I've been playing piano for most of my life. I know the pieces your pianist was supposed to perform. I can do it." Catherine studied his face, trying to figure out if he was serious. She looked at his janitor's uniform, his worn shoes, his calloused hands. David could see the doubt in her eyes, and he didn't blame her. He knew exactly how this looked. "You can play Chopin's Ballade No. 1? She asked, skepticism clear in her voice. "Yes, ma'am." "And the Nocturne in E-flat major? And the Fantaisie Impromptu?" "All of them." Catherine checked her watch. 25 minutes until showtime. She closed her eyes and David could practically see her mind working, weighing her options. She could tell the audience there was no performance and face their disappointment. Or she could take a massive gamble on her janitor who claimed he could play classical piano. "Can you play something for me right now?" she finally asked. "Not out there? Just here backstage. There's an upright piano in the rehearsal room." David nodded and followed her down the hall. His legs felt shaky, but he kept walking. They entered a small rehearsal room with an old upright piano in the corner. Catherine stood by the door, arms crossed, waiting. David sat down at the piano bench. His hands were trembling as he placed them on the keys. This was it. This was the moment where he either proved himself or made a complete fool of himself. He thought about all those nights playing alone in the empty concert hall. All those hours of practice when no one was watching. All those years of keeping his gift hidden, he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music that came from that old upright piano was extraordinary. David's fingers moved across the keys with confidence and precision. He played a section from Chopin's Ballade No. 1, and every note was perfect. But more than that, it was emotional. It was the sound of 15 years of longing, of talent kept secret, of dreams pushed aside but never forgotten. When he finished, the room was completely silent. David opened his eyes and looked at Catherine. Her hand was covering her mouth and her eyes were wide with shock. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're incredible. How did I not know about this?" David shrugged, a small smile on his face. "You never asked?" Catherine checked her watch again. 20 minutes. She made a decision. Okay, we're doing this. You're going to perform tonight." She paused and looked at his uniform. "But we need to do something about what you're wearing." They rushed to find him something better to wear, but nothing fit quite right. In the end, they decided he would perform in his janitor's uniform. There was no time for anything else. Catherine would introduce him, explain the situation, and hope the audience would be understanding. David walked onto that stage 15 minutes later, his heart hammering so hard he thought everyone could hear it. The concert hall was packed. 200 faces stared up at him, confusion written all over their expressions. He heard whispers. "Who is that? Is that the janitor? What's going on?" Catherine introduced him quickly, explaining that the original pianist was ill and David had graciously agreed to step in. The audience murmured. Some people looked skeptical. Others seemed intrigued. David sat down at the Steinway grand piano, the same piano he played every night when the building was empty. But tonight it felt different. The lights were bright. The audience was watching. This was real. He placed his fingers on the keys, closed his eyes, and let everything else fall away. The fear, the doubt, the years of hiding, all of it disappeared. There was only the music, and then David Chun began to play. The first notes filled the concert hall like water pouring into an empty glass. David's fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone in a janitor's uniform. He played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most difficult and emotional pieces ever written for piano. The murmuring in the audience stopped immediately. 200 people who had been skeptical just seconds ago now sat in complete silence. The only sound in that massive hall was the piano, and it was breathtaking. David wasn't just playing the notes correctly. Anyone with enough practice could do that. He was telling a story with the music. Every phrase had meaning. Every crescendo and every quiet moment carried emotion that you could feel in your chest. His interpretation was raw and honest in a way that only someone who had lived through real struggle could achieve. He played with his eyes closed for most of the performance, lost in the music. This was what he'd been doing alone for 15 years. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, he wasn't playing for himself. He was sharing something he'd kept hidden for so long, and it felt like finally letting out a breath he'd been holding forever. The piece built to its dramatic climax. David's hands flying across the keys with impossible speed and precision. Then it softened, becoming tender and melancholic. When he played the final notes, they hung in the air for a moment before fading into silence. David opened his eyes and lifted his hands from the piano. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The silence was so complete you could have heard a pin drop. Then the applause started. It began with one person standing up in the third row, clapping loudly. Then another person stood. Then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, applauding thunderously. The sound was deafening. People weren't just clapping politely. They were cheering. Some were crying. The woman in the front row had tears streaming down her face. David stood up slowly, unsure what to do. He'd never experienced anything like this. Catherine Reynolds rushed onto the stage, her own eyes wet with tears, and gave him a hug. The applause continued for what felt like forever, but was actually 8 solid minutes. What David didn't know was that someone in the 5th row had pulled out their phone. Early in the performance and hit record, the video captured everything. David in his gray janitor's uniform sitting at that magnificent piano, the skeptical faces in the audience, and then the transformation as the music took over. The rising emotion, the standing ovation. All of it, that person uploaded the video to social media at 11:30 that night with the caption, "Janitor fills in for sick pianist at fancy gala. What happens next will blow your mind." By the time David woke up the next morning, his entire life had changed. The video had been shared thousands of times overnight. By noon on Saturday, it had hit 1 million views. By Sunday evening, it was at 20 million. By Monday morning, it had exploded to over 50 million views and was still climbing. David's phone, which normally only got a few calls a week from his mother or his nephew, wouldn't stop ringing. He didn't recognize most of the numbers, so he stopped answering. But then the messages started filling up his voicemail. Reporters wanted interviews. Morning talk shows wanted him as a guest. Music agents wanted to represent him. Record labels wanted to sign him. Someone found his address. And by Monday afternoon, there were news vans parked outside his small apartment building. David peeked through his curtains and saw reporters with cameras waiting on the sidewalk. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on his door with wide eyes. "David, do you know there are TV people outside?" "What on earth is going on?" He showed her the video on his phone. Mrs. Patterson watched it with her hand over her heart, tears forming in her eyes. "That's you?" "Oh, David, that's beautiful. I had no idea." "Nobody did," he said quietly. The internet had gone wild trying to find out everything about him. People discovered his name, his age, where he worked, how long he'd been a janitor. Someone dug up an old photo from a community newsletter. Music bloggers were analyzing his performance, breaking down his technique. Classical music professors were posting videos about his interpretation. Everyone had an opinion. Most of the comments were incredibly positive. "This made me cry. Proof that talent can be found anywhere. This man deserves everything. Someone give him a record deal immediately." But there were also doubters. Some people claimed the video was fake or staged. Others said he was probably a failed professional musician looking for attention. A few cruel comments said he wasn't that good and people were just being emotional. David tried not to read the comments, but it was hard to look away. By Tuesday, the mainstream news had picked up the story. David's face was on television news programs across the country. "Hidden talent revealed" and "Janitor to genius overnight" were the headlines. A major morning show offered him $5,000 just to appear for a 10-minute interview. His inbox was flooded with opportunities, but David felt completely overwhelmed. He'd gone from invisible to being watched by millions in just a few days. He couldn't go to work without reporters following him. He couldn't buy groceries without someone recognizing him and wanting a photo. The attention was suffocating. He sat in his small apartment on Tuesday night, looking at all the emails and messages. Opportunities that seemed impossible just a week ago were now being handed to him. But instead of feeling excited, David felt terrified. Who was he to think he deserved any of this? He was 42 years old with no formal training. He was a janitor who played piano in secret. Real musicians spent their whole lives studying at conservatories and music schools. They had degrees and credentials and years of proper training. David had taught himself on a broken keyboard and practiced. Alone in an empty concert hall, the voice of doubt in his head was loud. "This is just a fluke. People will forget about you in a week. You're not actually that good. You're going to embarrass yourself if you try to be a real musician. Stay in your lane." His phone rang again. This time it was Catherine Reynolds from the Performing Arts Center. David had been avoiding most calls, but he answered this one. "David, how are you holding up?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Honestly, I'm freaking out a little bit," he admitted. "I can only imagine. Listen, I wanted you to know that what you did on Friday night was extraordinary. Not just the playing, but the courage it took to step forward. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like it." "Thanks," David said, though his voice was uncertain. Catherine continued. "I've received about 100 calls from people wanting to reach you. I didn't give anyone your contact information, of course. But David, there are some incredible opportunities here. Real opportunities. A prestigious music conservatory wants to offer you a full scholarship. A concert promoter wants to discuss a national tour. There's interest from major record labels. David felt his chest tighten. That's great, but I don't know if I'm ready for any of that. I don't even know if I deserve it. Why wouldn't you deserve it? Catherine asked. David, you have a gift. A real gift. I've heard hundreds of professional pianists play that same piece. You were better than most of them. The emotion, the technical skill, the interpretation, that wasn't luck. That was talent and dedication. But I'm not a trained musician. I'm just a janitor who taught himself. You're a musician who happens to work as a janitor, Catherine corrected. There's a difference. And you've been training yourself for decades. That counts for something. After they hung up, David sat in the dark, thinking. Part of him wanted to ignore all of this and go back to his quiet, invisible life. But another part of him, the part that had stayed late all those nights to play piano in an empty hall, knew he couldn't do that. Not anymore. The world had seen him now. Really seen him? And as terrifying as that was, it also meant he had a choice to make. He could hide and let this moment pass, or he could step fully into the light and see where it led. David looked at his reflection in the dark window. For the first time in his life, he didn't see just a janitor looking back. He saw someone with a decision to make. Someone whose ordinary life had cracked wide open, revealing something extraordinary underneath. The question was, what was he going to do about it? David spent the next week drowning in decisions. Every morning brought new opportunities, each one more incredible than the last. The Jefferson Conservatory of Music, one of the most prestigious schools in the country, sent him a formal letter offering a full scholarship. They'd waive all tuition and even provide a living stipend. At 42 years old, he could finally get the formal training he'd dreamed about as a kid. A concert promoter named Richard Joe called 3 times, trying to set up a meeting. He wanted to book David for a 20-city tour across the country. People want to see you perform live, Richard said. We could sell out theaters in every major city. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Then there were the record labels. 3 different companies wanted to sign him. They talked about recording an album, building his brand, getting his music into streaming platforms. One executive said they could make him a household name within 6 months. It all sounded amazing. Like a fairy tale. But David kept thinking about reality. His mother was 68 years old and dealing with diabetes and heart problems. The medical bills came every month, and insurance only covered part of it. David sent her $800 every single month without fail. She lived 3 hours away in a small town, and that money kept her afloat. Then there was his nephew, Tyler. The kid was 19 and in his second year of community college. His own father had left when Tyler was little, and David had stepped in as a father figure. Tyler wanted to transfer to a 4-year university next year, and David had promised to help with tuition. That was another commitment, another responsibility, and there was his own survival to think about. Rent, food, utilities. His janitor job paid $32,000 a year. Not much, but it was steady, reliable. He knew exactly how much would be in his paycheck every 2 weeks. Could he really give that up to chase a dream that might not work out? David sat at his kitchen table on Thursday night, surrounded by printed emails and letters. His head was pounding. Every option seemed to require him to give up something important. Accept the conservatory and he'd have no income. Do the concert tour and he'd have no time for his family. Sign with a record label and he'd be locked into contracts he didn't fully understand. He called his mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. David, honey, I saw you on the news again today. Everyone in town is talking about you. Mrs. Chung from church showed me the video on her phone. I must have watched it 20 times already. Mom, I need advice, David said, rubbing his tired eyes. What's wrong? You sound stressed. He explained everything. The scholarship, the tour offers, the record deals. And then he explained his fears. The money he needed to send her each month. Tyler's college. The risk of leaving his stable job. His mother was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm. David Chun, you listen to me. I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I'll figure out the medical bills. And Tyler is a smart boy. He can get student loans like everyone else. You've been putting everyone else first your whole life. When are you going to put yourself first? But Mom, no. Your grandmother would be so proud of you right now. She always knew you had something special. Don't let this pass by because you're worried about me. I'm your mother. Worrying about you is my job, not the other way around. David felt tears stinging his eyes. I'm scared. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? Then you fail, his mother said simply. But at least you tried. That's more than most people can say. And David? You are good enough. Anyone with eyes and ears can see that. After he hung up, David sat in the silence of his apartment. His mother's words echoed in his head. When was the last time he'd done something just for himself? When had he last taken a risk? The next day, he met with Catherine Reynolds at a small coffee shop away from the Performing Arts Center. She'd suggested they talk somewhere private, away from cameras and curious eyes. David arrived first and sat in a corner booth. Nervously stirring his coffee, Catherine arrived a few minutes later, looking more relaxed than he'd seen her in weeks. She ordered tea and sat down across from him. So, she said, have you made any decisions? David shook his head. I can't figure out what to do. Every choice feels wrong somehow. Catherine smiled knowingly. Can I tell you something about myself? Something not many people know? David nodded. I wanted to be an opera singer, she said. That was my dream when I was young. I had the voice for it too. I got accepted to Juilliard when I was 18. Full scholarship, everything paid for. Why didn't you go? Fear, Catherine said simply. My parents thought it was too risky. They wanted me to get a business degree, something practical. And I listened to them. I was scared they were right. So I went to business school instead, got a safe degree, started working in arts administration. I told myself I'd made the smart choice. She took a sip of her tea, her eyes distant. I spent 20 years wondering what would have happened if I'd gone to Juilliard. Would I have made it as a singer? Would I have failed? I'll never know because I didn't try. The regret was worse than any failure could have been. Is that why you gave me the chance to perform? David asked. Partly. When you stepped forward that night, I saw something in your eyes. Courage mixed with terror. I recognized it because I'd felt that same feeling once and I'd let it stop me. I wasn't going to let it stop you. David stirred his coffee, thinking hard. So what do I do? I have real responsibilities. People depending on me? Catherine leaned forward. You do what I should have done. You find a way to say yes to yourself without completely abandoning your responsibilities. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Over the next hour, they talked through options. Really talked, weighing pros and cons. Catherine had been in arts administration for decades. She knew how the music world worked. She helped David see possibilities he hadn't considered. By the time they finished their coffee, David had the beginning of a plan. He accepted the conservatory scholarship, but arranged to take classes part-time instead of full-time. He kept his janitorial job, but reduced his hours to 3 days a week. It would be exhausting, juggling both, but it was possible. The conservatory was excited enough about having him that they agreed to the unusual arrangement. He turned down the big concert tour for now. Too much, too soon. But he agreed to do a few select performances. Small venues, meaningful places. He'd perform at the Performing Arts Center for a special community event. He'd play at a benefit concert for music education. He'd choose his performances carefully instead of chasing every opportunity. As for the record labels, he decided to wait. He wanted to develop his skills more first, figure out what kind of musician he wanted to be. The offers would still be there in a year if he decided to pursue them, but David did make one decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He started offering free piano lessons every Saturday morning at the community center in his neighborhood. Kids whose families couldn't afford proper lessons could come learn from him. He saw himself in their eager faces, remembered what it felt like to love music but have no way to pursue it. The first Saturday, 5 kids showed up. The next week, it was 12. Word spread quickly. David, the viral piano sensation, was teaching for free, and he treated every student like they mattered. He remembered their names, encouraged their progress, made them believe they could do anything. Catherine helped him set up a small scholarship fund with some of the donation money that had poured in after his performance went viral. Money for kids who showed promise but couldn't afford instruments or lessons. David's new life wasn't perfect. He was exhausted most of the time, running between his janitorial shifts, conservatory classes, practice sessions, and teaching. Some days he questioned whether he'd made the right choice. Some nights he fell into bed so tired he could barely move. But he was also happier than he'd been in years. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was living in the light, using his gift, sharing what he loved with others. The fear was still there sometimes, that voice telling him he wasn't good enough. But now there was another voice too, one that said he was exactly where he needed to be. David Chun had spent 42 years being invisible. Now he was learning what it meant to be seen, to matter, to make a difference. And he was discovering that the best choice wasn't always the easiest one. Sometimes you had to be brave enough to believe in yourself, even when it scared you to death. He was stepping into his new life, one careful step at a time, carrying his past with him instead of running from it. Because that past, with all its struggles and secret practice sessions and quiet dreams, was what made his music so powerful. It was what made him who he was. 2 years passed faster than David ever thought possible. Looking back, he could barely recognize the man he used to be. The nervous janitor who played piano in secret felt like a different person entirely. Someone from another lifetime. The conservatory training had pushed him harder than anything he'd ever done. His instructors were demanding, expecting perfection from every exercise and every piece. At first, David struggled with the formal methods. He'd learned everything by ear and feeling, and now he had to understand music theory, proper technique, and classical interpretation on a much deeper level. There were moments when he wanted to quit. Days when his younger classmates, most of them in their 20s, seemed to grasp concepts faster than he could. Nights when he wondered if he was too old for this, if his informal education had left too many gaps. But David had something many of his classmates didn't have. He'd worked hard jobs his entire life. He knew what real struggle looked like. He understood perseverance in a way that only comes from years of showing up day after day, even when it's difficult. So he practiced harder, asked more questions, and refused to give up. His professors noticed. Dr. Helen Park, a renowned piano instructor, pulled him aside after class one day. "You know what makes you special, David? It's not just your natural talent. It's the maturity in your playing. You've lived life. That comes through in every note. These kids are technically brilliant, but they haven't suffered yet. They haven't loved and lost. You have, and it shows." The Saturday morning lessons at the community center had grown beyond anything David imagined. What started with 5 kids was now up to 40 students. Other musicians had heard about what he was doing and volunteered to teach alongside him. They offered guitar lessons, violin, drums, even voice training. The program had become something real, something that mattered. One of his first students, a 12-year-old girl named Jenny, had just been accepted into a prestigious summer music program. Her single mother worked 2 jobs and could never have afforded private lessons. When Jenny found out she'd been accepted, she'd cried in David's arms. "I never thought someone like me could do something like this," she'd whispered. David knew exactly how she felt. The scholarship fund he'd started had grown too. Local businesses donated. People who'd seen his viral video sent checks. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to buy instruments for kids who needed them and cover application fees for music programs. Every dollar went directly to young musicians who reminded David of himself. 18 months after his viral performance, a record producer named James Liu reached out again. He'd contacted David before, but David had said he wasn't ready. Now James had a different proposal. "I don't want to change who you are," James explained over lunch. I've been watching what you're doing. The teaching, the community work, the way you choose your performances carefully. You're building something authentic. What if we made an album that reflects that? Original compositions, pieces that tell your story? David had been composing music in his spare time, which was limited but precious. Short pieces inspired by his journey. A song about his grandmother and that broken keyboard. A piece about empty concert halls and secret dreams. Music about second chances and finding courage. I want to call it The Long Road Home, David told James. Because that's what this has been. A long journey back to something I lost when I was young. They recorded the album over 6 months, fitting sessions around David's classes and teaching and the few janitorial shifts he still kept. The music was deeply personal, blending classical piano with modern touches. Each piece told part of his story without words, letting the piano speak for him. The album released on a Tuesday in spring. David didn't expect much. He figured a few thousand people might download it, mostly people who remembered his viral video. He'd be happy with that. By Friday, The Long Road Home had hit #1 on the classical music charts. By the following week, it crossed over to the general album charts, something that almost never happened for classical music. Critics called it hauntingly beautiful and a masterpiece of emotional storytelling. But what mattered most to David were the messages from regular people. Your music helped me through my divorce. I'm 60 years old, and your story inspired me to finally learn piano. I play your album for my kids every night. Thank you. The success of the album led to an invitation David never dreamed possible. Carnegie Hall, one of the most famous concert venues in the world, wanted him to perform. A full evening concert. Just him and the piano. David stood backstage at Carnegie Hall on the night of the performance, his hands shaking just like they had 2 years ago at the gala. But this time, the shaking was different. It wasn't just fear. It was excitement, gratitude, and disbelief all mixed together. Catherine Reynolds had flown in for the concert. She found him backstage and gave him a long hug. You did it, she said simply. You really did it. We did it, David corrected. None of this happens without you believing in me that night. The concert hall was sold out. 3,000 people filled every seat. David's mother sat in the front row, tears already streaming down her face before the music even started. Tyler was next to her, holding up his phone to record. Mrs. Patterson had traveled from their old neighborhood. Students from his Saturday classes sat together in a section they'd reserved just for them. David walked onto that stage, and the applause was thunderous, but he barely heard it. He was focused on the piano waiting for him. On the music he was about to share, he sat down, took a breath, and began to play. He started with the piece he'd written about his grandmother, the one that started everything. Then he played Chopin, the same piece from that viral night, but deeper now, more refined. He played his own compositions, each one a chapter of his journey. Between pieces, David did something unusual. He talked to the audience. Really talked like they were friends gathered in his living room. 2 years ago, I was cleaning this kind of stage, not performing on it, he said. I was 42 years old and convinced my life was already written, that it was too late for dreams. But here's what I learned. It's never too late. Not at 42, not at 60, not at 80. Your gift doesn't have an expiration date. The audience hung on every word. I spent 15 years playing piano in an empty room because I was scared. Scared I wasn't good enough. Scared people would laugh. Scared I'd fail. And you know what? Some of those fears came true. I did struggle. Some people did doubt me. But the joy of finally living honestly, of sharing what I love with others, was worth every moment of fear. He finished the concert with a piece he'd written called The Janitor's Song. It started quiet and simple, like a person humming while they worked. Then it grew, becoming more complex and beautiful, representing the hidden depths in ordinary people. By the end, it was triumphant and soaring. When the final note faded, the audience stood as one. The ovation lasted 12 minutes. David stood at that piano, looking out at those 3,000 faces, and he felt something he'd never felt before. He felt like he belonged, like he deserved to be there, like he was exactly where he was always meant to be. Even if it took 42 years to arrive, after the concert, David spent an hour meeting people in the lobby. Old students, new fans, fellow musicians. One elderly man shook his hand with tears in his eyes. "I'm 76 years old," the man said. "I played violin when I was young but gave it up. Tomorrow I'm buying a violin. Thank you for reminding me it's not too late." That night, lying in his hotel room, David thought about the journey. From that broken keyboard in his grandmother's apartment to Carnegie Hall, from invisible janitor to someone whose music touched millions. From hiding his gift to sharing it freely, he thought about all the kids in his Saturday classes who would grow up knowing that their circumstances didn't define their potential. He thought about the scholarship fund that would help dozens more. He thought about every person who'd heard his story and decided to take a chance on their own dreams. David Chun had spent most of his life being ordinary, invisible, hiding in the shadows. But he'd learned something profound. He'd always been extraordinary. The gift had always been there. He just needed the courage to let others see it. His journey proved that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. That ordinary people carry extraordinary gifts. That one moment of courage can change everything. And that sometimes the greatest success isn't measured in fame or money, but in the lives you touch and the hope you give to others. David finally understood what his grandmother had tried to tell him all those years ago. Music wasn't just about playing notes on a keyboard. It was about connection, about truth, about having the courage to share your authentic self with the world, and that was a lesson worth waiting 42 years to learn.